We started a new 3-week study on Hosea chapter 3, the prophecy there, and we have a kind of a plan this week. We were going to share context about why Hosea 3 is important, and then next Sunday, we were going to talk about a couple of clues that might help us properly interpret Hosea 3 and understand the prophecy. And then the final week, we'll actually go into the details of Hosea 1 and 2 and 3 and share an understanding of that prophecy that hopefully will be helpful to us both in understanding God's plan as well as in our lives being able to see God's character and imitating Him. We started today by reading Psalm 74 and just hearing the psalmist who had come back from exile and was hoping for the restoration of Israel, and hearing him say, How long? How long have you forgotten, God? Please remember your covenant and act. How long will it be? There's no miracles. There's no prophets among us, and we don't know how long. And we looked at Kings really briefly as a reminder to a previous study and showed how God had indeed not forgotten, but God had refused to continue to show mercy as He had in previous generations. When they would fail and break a covenant, He would restore and renew a covenant with them. And then in the book of Kings, He no longer had patience and compassion on them and allowed them to be destroyed and sent to exile. But they had come back from exile, and they were hoping to see God's restoration of His covenant people, and they were asking how long. And Moses had written about that in Deuteronomy 30, that they would be exiled and they would come back, and He would bless them more than their fathers. He would even circumcise their heart. And the latter prophets came along and provided more details. Jeremiah told what that covenant would be like, the new covenant. Isaiah told with whom it would be made, through this suffering servant. And Ezekiel came and told where it would be. It would be back in the land, in a restored Jerusalem, a new temple, and gave prophecies related to that. So the psalmist was right to ask, when is it, God? When will that be? How long? And there was another famous exile, Daniel, in Daniel 9, who was asking the same question and was reading himself in the book of Jeremiah and found the answer. It would be 70 years is what Jeremiah said before they would return. And so Daniel prayed and asked that God would complete the plan. But the message came back to Daniel that it wasn't going to be 70 years for the completion of the plan. Sure, they would come back, but it would be 77s before the full completion of the plan. 70 weeks, 77-year periods of 490 years. And that would be what Daniel would need to wait for, not the 70 years. It wasn't time for that. And we talked about the latter prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, helping with what God would do, who He would do it with, and where. But there was also the 12, which we call the minor prophets, and Malachi was the end of that, and he had the same message that was given to Daniel. The day of the Lord was still future, and so they would need to wait. And so the psalmist and Daniel and the faithful remnant that had come back from exile continued to wait for years, for hundreds of years, without miracles, signs, without a prophet, until John the Baptist came on the scene and announced the kingdom was then near. And then, of course, Jesus, the greatest prophet, even greater, the Son of God, came, and He was the king. That's why the kingdom was near. But He was rejected, and He was crucified. And so how did that fit? Well, the early apostles, their preaching, they said in Acts 2, that was part of God's plan as well. It was God's plan for Him to suffer, but now they should repent, and so that times of restoration could come. And the outpouring of the Spirit was a sign that time was near, and the day of the Lord could be near, and the restoration of Israel could be near. But as decades passed and the miraculous works done by the apostles faded off the scene, and even the prophets, the gift of prophecy began to diminish, the Christian church, the Christ followers began to ask, how long? What's going on? And Paul even had to correct the Thessalonians who were saying, well, maybe the day of the Lord's already come. Or Paul, writing to Timothy, said there's people teaching the resurrection's already come. And Paul said, no, stay in the faith, remain. It's all those things, all those promises, restoration, resurrection, they're coming, but they haven't happened yet. It's future. The day of the Lord is still future. And then, of course, 70 AD happened, where Rome destroyed Jerusalem, and maybe that was going to lead to the restoration after that horrible, horrible day of judgment on Jerusalem. But even then, decades passed, and John had to write in the 90s his gospel to encourage people to remain in the faith, to continue believing. He contrasted Judas and his walking away from the faith with the apostles who, because Christ had prayed for them in John 17 and in the high priestly prayer, they remained. And he wrote the gospel, according to John 20, verse 31, so that people would continue believing and not turn away. He wrote John 21 to show that people could be forgiven of turning away like Peter had and come back. And Peter's death shouldn't be a reason for them to fear and to leave the faith, like God's plan wasn't working out. Christ had predicted that Peter would die before, and even John getting aged, and there was a rumor that John wouldn't die. So how did that work since he's getting older? John said and wrote in John 21, that you misheard. That's not what was said. Jesus said, if I wanted him to stay, what is that to you? But he didn't say that John wouldn't die. So all of that was to help early believers who were asking the same question as the psalmist in Psalm 74. How long? When, God? When you will restore? And even Peter, which we're studying in 2 Peter as a church together, he said, hey, times are going to come in these last days where people are going to begin to mock because it's going to look like nothing's changed. There's no more signs, there's no more prophets, and it just goes on. And if that were true of the first century, it's certainly true for us here now, 2,000 years later. And as a church that still believes there'll be a restoration of Israel, the nation of Israel, there'll be an outpouring of the Spirit on them, and they will come to know the Lord fully. God will circumcise their hearts and bless them more than their fathers. We believe that'll happen in the millennial kingdom. But not everyone holds that view. Some think we're maybe in the kingdom now, or maybe there is no kingdom. Maybe the kingdom will be brought before Christ returns. Maybe a mocker might say it's all made up. Why do you even still pretend that this is real? There are no signs, no miracles, no wonders, no prophets. Why do you still hold to the faith? And we ask the question as a church, what do we need? What would help us as we 2,000 years later are trying to remain faithful and continue believing? And the answer was we essentially need what John provided to his first century audience. We need a recognition that God already had all this plan, these 2,000 years plan. That's not outside his plan. And we would have needed him to write that down and say, look, I said in advance, not only did I know, but I wrote down that I knew these 2,000 years were going to come. This long period of time of waiting was going to come. That was all part of my plan. And we said, the claim is that we're going to unpack in the next 2 weeks. We have that. That exists. And it exists in the latter prophets, which, as we mentioned, Jeremiah tells us about what the new covenant was going to be like, and Isaiah with whom, and Ezekiel where. The latter prophets, what we call often the minor prophets, the 12, they talk about when. We mentioned Malachi earlier, but in the 12, especially in Hosea, we answer the question, we have God's statement that he knew about this time period in advance, and he prophesied in advance, specifically in Hosea 3. In Hosea 3, these days are prophesied, and so God knew about them in advance. We can stand on that. We can be firm in our faith, knowing that this long period of time, without prophets, without miracles, was all part of what God had planned, this period of waiting, we could call it. But that he will return. Israel will return. They'll be renewed in their relationship. God will restore them, and there'll be a period of a kingdom on earth, a 1,000-year reign that will come after that. And it's that we're going to study next week. We'll study, again, 2 clues to help us make sure our interpretation of Hosea 3 is correct. We'll chase down those 2 clues, and then 2 weeks from now we'll look at Hosea 3 in detail along with Hosea 1 and 2. So God bless you, and we look forward to having you along with us in this study.